All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming to the Theological Forum. We're talking about the church and the arts today, how the church can encourage and partner with artists so they can use their gifts to serve the church and glorify God. Let's see, we've got a great panel here today. I'm not going to talk very much, so let me introduce our panel. Starting at the far left, you know him, you love him. Gerald McDermott. Dr. McDermott is the author, co-author, or editor of many books, including A Trinitarian Theology of Religions, Jonathan Edwards Confronts the Gods, The New Christian Zionism, Israel Matters, Cancer, A Medical and Spiritual Guide for Patients and Their Families, and Famous Stutterers. Later this year, he'll publish a new book called Everyday Glory, The Revelation of God in All of Reality, which will discuss how we see the beauty of God in different aspects of creation, including nature, science, law, history, animals, sex, and sports. An Anglican priest, he's associate pastor at Christ the King Anglican Church, and is married to Jean, who I believe is here in the back.
Yes, back.
We have 10 seconds. All right, and next we have Nancy Carroll. Nancy is president of Inspiro, which inspires Birmingham's creative community to bring beauty and hope to the city and its churches. Nancy writes and teaches Bible studies, provides soul care, speaks, and leads retreats for leadership teams, artists, and church groups. She helps people re-find their voices, calling, creativity, and courage. She also writes middle grade and contemporary fiction. Previously, she taught Bible study fellowship and led her own marketing communications firm. Nancy has a master's degree in theological studies from East Divinity School.
Okay. The only relevant thing there. Okay.
All right, and then next we have Wynn Reagan. So Wynn serves as visiting assistant professor of music and worship and associate director for the Center for Worship and the Arts here at Samford. Wynn offers courses on worship leadership and the theology and history of worship while cultivating worship resources, guiding strategic programs, and developing research at the intersection of youth ministry studies and worship studies for the Center for Worship and the Arts. Wynn holds an MTS from Duke Divinity School and a BA and PhD from Duke. Wynn has served as director of worship in Presbyterian and Anglican congregations in North Carolina and actively serves as a contributor for Cardiphonia, a national network of worship songwriters who write music for the joy and edification of God's church. Wynn is also a leading expert on the history and theology of contemporary worship music and has given talks at various universities, published articles in Christianity Today and Religion and American Culture, and written chapters in You Call Me Out Upon the Waters, Critical Perspectives on the Hillsong Movement, and The Spirit of Praise, Music and Worship in Pentecostal Charismatic Christianity. And last to my right, we have Catherine Ladd.
Thank you.
Kat is a Beeson student pursuing a maths degree. She received her bachelor's at the University of Alabama in art history and is extremely fond of both Dutch Baroque art and Black contemporary art. Catherine serves as the head of the art ministry at St. Peter's Anglican Church, where she's been a member for 9 years. She also enjoys writing speculative fiction and think pieces on pop culture. All right, now we got some questions here. I guess let's start very broadly. Why is it important to engage the arts in Christian life and worship? What does art do for the church that nothing else does? Anybody want to tackle that first? Yes. Why is it important to engage the arts in Christian life and worship? Wynn, you want to take it?
Sure. We turn this on?
Oh, no, that...
Oh, it's already recording.
You don't want double?
Oh. You really do want double.
Turn it on,
Okay.
pass it around. That'll be fun.
So why is it important to engage in the arts in Christian life and worship? I think two things come to mind for me. One, very briefly, I just go back to J.R.R. Tolkien. And for Tolkien, describing us theologically as sub-creators. So we're made in the imago Dei, we're made in the image of God, and as being made in the image of God, we get to participate in some possibly small way, but in a real way, as sub-creators under the lordship of Christ. And to be a sub-creator then is really part of our humanity. And so the arts are a deep integral part of that humanity because it is that act of creation within our role of sub-creating. I think the second thing is incarnation, right? all art is rooted in the incarnation. All art is only possible because of the incarnation. What does that mean, right? So the incarnation, we can think of the incarnation as the foundational act of what theologian Trevor Hart might call art as moving beyond itself into something else, taking the material and making something more than the sum of its parts, and then apocalyptically revealing a new reality. And if we think of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, right, that is kind of the art of salvation, right? It is God creating and taking the uncreated and taking the uncreated and joining it with created and actually doing that forever, right, in a sense, through Jesus Christ, which in and of itself is this beautiful scandal in a way. But all art is founded into that, right? Because every time we as sub-creators move into art, we are taking material creation, we are crafting it in a way, we are breathing our own imago Dei into it and moving it beyond the sum of its parts, and at the same time unveiling another way of perceiving reality. You want to go next?
Dr. McDermott.
Oh, okay. Here.
Well, now, do you want us to use this?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh,
I think
okay.
they want you to use it.
All right.
Yeah.
When I can hardly add to what Wen said, it was terrific. But a little subnote under Wen's wonderful theological introduction, I'd say, is that in Christian life and worship, we want to engage and appeal to the whole person, not just the mind. And we all are artistic to some degree, whether we know it or not. And secondly, to the extent that our churches are participating in the historic liturgical and sacramental traditions, and my colleague and good friend, Professor Mark Devine, has been teaching me these last 3 years that I've been here at Beeson that there's a long history of Baptist liturgical and sacramental traditions. To that extent, we are already engaging the arts in Christian life and worship because Christian liturgy is artistic. Christian sacraments are artistic.
I'm going to probably do it from the practical end, and so if y'all do that. And our organization in Sparrow was partly started because of that. A Christian fine artist and I came together to form it, and an artist would never ask that question. In a sense, they would, that's their living, breathing self. And so often they have felt, when that question has been asked, they have felt separated from the church, like, what is wrong with art? And just like Dr. McDermott said, it's a chance to engage all five senses. And coming from a Reformed tradition, sometimes the only senses that seem safe are those that are visual or auditory, and they narrow it down. And so how can we become whole? And I don't know if any of y'all grew up doing that. My kids did Flat Stanley. Did y'all have to do Flat Stanley? Anybody? Anyways, it's a kid's book that basically you have this flat Stanley, two-dimensional, that goes different places. And so for me, the church without the arts is like a Flat Stanley. So many people talk about a vertical relationship with God and a horizontal relationship with people instead of a three-dimensional aspect of all of life. So I guess that's where I would come from, is that the question, I hope there comes a time when it's not asked. The question's not asked.
There's not much more I can add, but I will say from my own perspective that engaging art from a secular point of view, it evokes emotion. You know, you look at art, visual art, and you cry, you hear a song, you cry, you feel this emotion. And for a long time, I did have that removed from my own faith because I didn't think those things could mesh. And then once I was introduced to real Christian art, and we can go into this a little bit later, but I'm not talking about just like, was it Thomas Kincaid? I'm not talking about just art like that. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, I mean, real art that.
I'm just saying it's not real art.
I'm saying art that allows us to be human and feel, but also feel connected to God, and that when you can incorporate that in your worship, that you can look at a piece or listen to a song and you're worshiping God through that. And then just from the point of view, from an artist's perspective, when they're making the art, they're worshiping God. You know, they're not just doing this. A lot of artists do it for money, but they're also doing it because they have to get it out. They have to get what they're feeling out onto the canvas or out in dance. Dance is another form of worship. So I think that it's important that the church incorporates it, because that we are creative beings. A lot of us can't, survive without creating. So if we go every Sunday morning, and a lot of us worship other than just Sunday, if we go Sunday morning in church and we're singing these songs, why not, why is that not art, We can do it in a visual standpoint. We can do it with our bodies. It's just so beautiful to take what God has given us and worship him with it.
So secondly, I thought it'd be good to lay some scriptural and historical theological foundations for all you folks who buy into the regulative principle. So could anybody here speak to examples of, how the arts were incorporated into worship in the scriptures, or how the Israelites viewed and made use of art in worship?
Anybody want to grab that? Yeah, okay.
No one else. Go for it.
Well, David in 1 Chronicles, the picture of his introduction of music into what was the first tabernacle and then temple worship, and making it integral to worship. The use of the Levites as musicians, and making it not just an add-on, but integral. And then you have the picture in 2 Chronicles of the great king going off to war, 2 Chronicles 20, and sending the musicians in front. They did the battle, and it was the artistic worship that slew the enemy.
Well, I'll stay with David then. And in 2 Samuel, I think the biggest warning is he fully worshiped God through dance, and but Michal, his wife, scorned him. She was the one that was shamed. I think of the woman breaking the alabaster jar. That is a form of art. Artists feel like that's what they're doing, is breaking the alabaster jar. And those around them often whisper, how foolish is this? How unpractical is this? But she was the one that was remembered for what she did. And then just go back even to think, as an artist would think about Moses when he saw the burning bush. He turned and saw the bush. He beheld it. So even as you go through the Old Testament, all those times of beholding, paying attention, is a form of art. So
I have nothing to add to. I mean, it's just integral. That really
Yeah.
struck me, because just thinking about the tabernacle in Exodus and the gilding of the altar, the tapestry, and all the craftsmen and artists who came in and were absolutely integral to creating that space. Yeah.
I definitely have nothing to add to that. That was awesome.
Say just one more thing. Bezalel, who was the principal
Artist of the tabernacle and the leader of the artist, was said to be inspired by the Spirit of God. So, and the pattern that God gave Moses, he said, we are building this tabernacle, and then eventually David says God gave him a pattern to commission Solomon with to build the temple. Both patterns, now they weren't the same, but they both were extremely specific about how beautiful all the details of the tabernacle and temple were to be, that is, that God is concerned about beauty in worship.
Great. So maybe from here we can go to appropriate uses of art in the church, or I don't know, ways that different traditions approach art. Like I know that there are some traditions that have more trouble with visual representation than others. How do you navigate stuff like that, and where, how do we determine an appropriate use of the arts in worship?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I'm struck by what you said earlier because I think that this is so important for the arts. So for traditions that don't partake in visual worship, at least in kind of the ether and the theological, doctrinal kind of elements, I think that's actually pretty rare in America. I think there are Presbyterians, let's say, who have kind of a whitewashed, more minimalist approach. But I think in general, just picking on Presbyterians, most Presbyterian churches in America are going to be somehow engaged with the visual, whether it be a giant screen, right, and they're projecting things on it, like most American churches. And so I think that actually in America, the bigger problem to me is, this is back to your point, about art. So we often use like, what's the goal of art? And I think that's the wrong word. Certainly there's a telos for art, right? It has an end. It always needs to be pointing back to the creator. But I think as Americans, we're obsessed with efficacy, efficiency. We're obsessed with utility. And so art for us is deeply utilitarian. And I think that's a big detriment to actually what art is and what God created art to be. That art requires a wasting of time, as Marva Dawn puts it, a royal waste of time in her book. It requires a playfulness. It is not necessarily fruitful as the world sees it. It is not efficient. It is not productive always. And when I think about this question, what's appropriate, to me, like what blares on my mind in American Christianity is really like, how is it useful, right? Like, how am I going to use it? And it's not that art isn't useful. It's not that it doesn't do things. It does. I mean, Jamie Smith would probably say like art and worship is one of the most formative things that can happen, right? But asking, is it useful? Are we asking in this kind of deeply utilitarian fashion? And if so, I think that's going to be impoverishing to the way we understand art.
Okay. Quickly, it's hard to, I think always globally. So thinking specifically about utilitarian uses. So let me talk in metaphors. In a church, the church that I've attended, the biblical metaphor that they use is as a battleship, that they're a battleship that is sending us out to the world to save the world, and you come back to the battleship, you get refueled, restocked to go back out. And there is a place for the whole battle metaphor, but there's also a metaphor for the feast of the hearth and the home and beauty. And what I keep telling gently, well, that's hard. My pastor is, who wants to live on a battleship? If you're going to rescue somebody, you don't want to rescue them to bring them back to a battleship. You want to have the aroma of what's coming. Dr. Smith taught us well to preach the eschaton. And I think what the arts at their best can do is give us a hope that this isn't all there is and there's more to come. So how do you incorporate that into your churches? So.
Nice. Picking up on what Wen was saying about usefulness, that art is not useful in a worldly sense. Neither is worship. Worship is very impractical in a worldly sense. But the thing about images, it's been a big battle in the history of the church. In the 7th and 8th centuries saw the iconoclasm controversy. And John of Damascus, who interestingly served under Muslims, and much of the iconoclastic controversy was stimulated by the rise of Islam and Islamic pressure on the Christian churches, wrote this wonderful book on images. And he made the argument that the second commandment against images is directed against, and of course Martin Luther then later picks up on this and says essentially the same thing using John Damascus, that the second commandment against the use of images is, the context was the images of the false gods from the, coming from the pagans all around the ancient Near East, pressuring, seducing the Israelites. And but even in the Reformed tradition, there's starting to be a retrieval of the use of beauty and the use of imagery. And Belden Lane is a Reformed theologian who wrote a very important book, I think, back in 2011, Oxford University Press, titled "Ravished by Beauty: Reformed Spirituality," which shows ways that the Reformed tradition can retrieve these concepts of beauty.
I think what's really important in trying to see what art is appropriate is in the creation of art. And I've talked about this with a few people before. Are you familiar with the piece, excuse my language, Piss Christ? I've had debates with a few people whether that's real Christian art or not, and the artist himself is Catholic and he has his beliefs. But I think that our jobs as Christians are to be witnesses in everything that we do, how we live, how we speak, and how we engage the world outside of the church. So if we are artists and we make art that is confusing to a non-Christian, that when I first saw the piece, without any context, I assumed that it was mocking Christ. So I think we have to be careful in how we're creating music, how we're creating art, and what's appropriate is it being a witness to the gospel? Is it portraying what the scriptures say? And if somebody that's a non-believer, would they look at it and congratulate you because you are making a point to criticize the church? Or are you really trying to get them to see Christ in it? I think that's something that's really hard to do with art or artists that are Christian artists who are not making images of Jesus, who are not painting images of Jesus. It's hard for them to really be that witness, but still, as long as we're avoiding inappropriate art, I guess is the best way to put it. And that's a really fine line today, because then you have so many, just take Twitter, for example. There are so many Twitter debates on theology. I mean, you really don't have to go to seminary. You can just go on Twitter and see what everybody believes. It's insane. And so when you have these outlets where people can speak so firmly about what they think Christ is saying and what they think we should believe, and then add that onto art that becomes popular, and then more people are seeing it, then that becomes a witness. And if it's not true Christianity, then we're teaching people the false gospel. So, I mean, that's really more of the appropriateness, I guess. It's just being careful on how we create our art and how we present it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to piggyback, that's really good. I think that it struck me too that maybe another way of putting it is, instead of maybe asking the question like, is art Christian or unchristian, which can be helpful, but maybe more helpful is it true or is it not true? And even then within that, like each piece of art, like us, you may have true elements within a piece and then untrue elements within it too. So how do we create a culture where we are helping our congregants, right, discern, like you're saying, discern, be able to come to a piece and not either instantly react, but say, okay, what here is true and what is untrue? Wouldn't that be cool to kind of create that kind of culture?
Okay, so to move to something a little more ministry focused, almost everybody in here is either a pastor or a future pastor. So most of what we'll be doing is leading in services, preaching, teaching, that kind of stuff. What can pastors and preachers glean from the arts that can help us in our preaching, leading liturgies, teaching, stuff like that?
Oh, this is really good.
So you are a preacher, you're a pastor, you are an artist. You are an artist. Preaching is an art form.
Amen. We have really talked about within Sparrow, basically what we do is try to nurture our creative community, but also within that so that we can reach the city, but also engage with the church in a very honest and good way so that there's a better understanding. And one of the things we think of is most artists are prophets. They see and sense and have to say things before others. They're culture makers, they do that. But pastors are as well. Pastors and preachers, it's the same thing. You see and sense things, you read the word, and you are compelled to share that. So, amen to that art form of preaching and pastoring. So there's a lot of practical ways that you can incorporate artists into your congregations and see me for the ways that later for the way artists have really left the church because there's a lot of things that have made them just leave the church. But for you just to understand that you too are an artist, I think is really important.
I think art can help us see the beauty of God and help us understand the Bible. Number one, the beauty of God. You know, previous generations in the church have put emphasis on God's truth and God's goodness, but not as much on God's beauty. And I think to the 21st century, we are facing in the global north more and more people who are losing touch with Orthodox Christianity or have rejected it. And to point to the beauty of God, I think, is a message that will start to resonate more and more in the 21st century and in the global south also. And secondly, to understand the Bible, you know the Bible, well, to understand the God of the Bible is full of metaphors about God. God is a rock, for example. God is my shield. Well, what's a metaphor? You know, it comes from the Greek, meta, beyond, and the word for carry. It carries us beyond. So God is not literally a rock, but it's a metaphor for God's stability in the midst of chaos. And beauty is a kind, poetry is full of metaphors. And I would argue that the Bible is often poetic, like the statement, God is a rock. That's a poetic statement. That's meant to be taken poetically, metaphorically, and not literally. And it teaches us about who God is. And so too, to the extent that, that poetry is metaphorical. For instance, I think of Giacometti, those sculptures. My wife is a sculptor. If you remember the sculptures of Giacometti, these big, tall, super skinny men and women, they look like about 16 feet tall. And I don't know if Giacometti himself said so in explaining his sculptures, but some interpreters have said this is a picture of existence, not essence, but existence. That is, that all of creation is radically contingent. It was not there yesterday, and it's not going to be there tomorrow, but it's there today. You and I weren't there, in your case, 25, 30 years ago. In my case, 100 years ago. And you're not going to be there in another 100 years, and I'm not going to be here in another 20 years, maybe. 30 years, okay. My existence is a miracle. Your existence is a miracle. It's not necessary, it's contingent. And the Giacometti's portrayal of the human being as this long, 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 skinny thing, according to some interpreters, point to the radical contingency of each one of us. It's a poetic metaphor that coming from art to teach us about existence?
I think in a very simple way of thinking about it too is that we respond to art. So if a pastor uses visual art in their sermon, some of my favorite sermons use poetry. Those are the ones that I feel more deeply. And I am not a preacher. God has not given me that gift. But when I have to give homilies at church, I try to use poetry. Or if I write something, I try to use art because I think, as I said earlier, it brings out emotion and we relate to it. I read a book by Now and On, the parable of the prodigal son, but Rembrandt's painting in particular. And he went, I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's so good. It's an easy read. It's really good. But he kept going back to Rembrandt's painting over and over and over again because he was seeing it in different ways. And he saw how he was the prodigal son. He saw how he was the brother, and at times he could be the father. So he reacted to it. He's reacting to a piece of art, but in a very spiritual way. And I think preachers and pastors can take from that, how are your congregants hearing what you're trying to say? And with all honesty, we can listen to a sermon over and over, different sermons over and over and over again, and we're hearing it audibly, but sometimes we need our other senses stimulated so we can actually get what the pastor is trying to convey.
Yeah, so to follow up with this question a little bit, we have a lot of diversity in this room based on traditions. So we go to a lot of different kinds of churches. Some of our churches are very high church and liturgical, and others have a more free church feel to them. I wondered if you guys had any thoughts on what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of each of those traditions. What do they do well that maybe my Anglican tradition doesn't, and vice versa. Any thoughts on that?
So what tradition are you?
Presbyterian.
Okay, so we have a little diversity because the rest of us are Anglican. So we're not very diverse here. Sorry. Quickly, I think, so, no, you didn't. And I'm a mutt, probably like many of us. I've kind of, I've been Presbyterian, grew up Methodist, and I was baptized Episcopalian, so I've returned to my baptism. That's at least what I'm narrating this whole thing is. So I think in the Anglican tradition, I think one of the weaknesses is losing a playfulness, losing the reality, as C.S. Lewis put it, that we are dumb children playing with mud in the sand, right? When we're at the beach, when we're in worship, there's a sense in which, yes, there's a deep, deep gravity and holiness to worship, and at the same time, maybe in a scandalous, incarnated fashion, there's a messiness. There is a playfulness right there. So I think in my experiences, sometimes the weakness in the tradition as I've experienced it has been I take myself too seriously, or my colleagues in my congregation do. Having been in other circles too, maybe more Baptist or non-denom or evangelical Presbyterian congregations, I think I would just go back to the utilitarian aspect. We need to grow this church. So to grow this church, we have to get a fog machine, right? It's just a one-to-one thing, right? We're not going to ask, theologically, do we need the fog machine and what does it do? We just know that if we have the fog machine, this demographic will start coming. Now, I will confess, maybe someone can develop a theology for fog machines, right? There's a sense in which the wonderful smells and blessings of the incense rising up to meet the Father, there's maybe at least some clouding there. Maybe we can make it smell a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you could build a theology of fog machines, but that's never happening, right? So I think the utility to me is what comes to mind as a weakness on other traditions.
But there is an article in that. So
Yeah.
And I grew up Catholic, and then and when I grew up Catholic and way, way back when, the scriptures were not really introduced to us. And so it was in college that I one-on-one was able to look at scripture, and it was just powerful, and it's helped to define my life. So I missed that when I was growing up, but as I have been fascinated by scripture, and as you as you get into divinity school and you start to parse it apart and try to almost analyze it, somehow some of the mystery is taken out of it. There's a sense with some traditions of uber control. And a lot of the questions that you're posing as a pastor is, well, how do I control? Not, you're not saying that, but it's either a fear-based or control-based question. Like, how do we do something well? But what you're really saying is, how do we not mess up? And so what I think I have lost when I kind of began to narrow in on the beauty and importance of accuracy of Scripture was losing the mystery and bigness of who God is, that he doesn't come just in 5 points. So if you are able to recapture a sense of the mystery of who God is, then it kind of puts you back into an appropriate place of who you are. And you can still study all the traditions.
Yeah, just to go to answer your question about where is there art in other traditions, I'd say looking outside the Anglican tradition, say to Baptists, and I'd say particularly African American Baptists, there's an artistry in preaching that is, and I think there's a lot of it here at Beeson Divinity School where we focus on the artistry, the proper artistry, not for performance, of course, but the proper artistry of great biblical preaching. And that's something that we Anglicans have to learn from other traditions represented here at Beeson.
One of my main regrets about being Anglican, there are very few, is that in our worship we don't have dance. Like when I grew up I would visit, because I grew up Episcopalian, so we didn't have it there either, but when I would visit my aunt's church and I would see the girls go up and they would do their dances, and it was so beautiful. And for a while I did praise dancing for another church, and it was freeing to this music, and now I'm moving to it. And then, which I know a lot of people have their debates on mimes in the church, but even that is really impressive, and that's particularly in the Black church. It's impressive how they move, but in the Anglican church we don't have things like that. But I find beauty in the altar. Like I love being on the altar guild. There's beauty in how it's set up, how we go to the table. There's art in that, but outside of it, and outside of bringing in icons and how we use at our church, we use banners and going with the liturgical colors, there is not much art. So I would say that I envy other churches, other traditions that incorporate more of the body.
Yeah, and that just to tip that too, that I just realized that was all negative. That the Anglican tradition too, to your point, right, that we don't do dance, we really should, because that'd be awesome. But that the Anglican tradition and other liturgical traditions too are somatically oriented in that we kneel, right? And we have kneeling, and we have other posturings that involve our body, so that we're not just brains kind of walking around and assenting to things. I think that's a real positive, and dance would be a good addition.
Yeah, I think it is, right? Because I think it is an art. I think
Crossing yourself and posturing, that is in the sense that you're taking the material and you're intentionally moving that, and is it moving beyond itself? Are you simply doing this, right?
praying with your body.
Yeah, it's praying with your body. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And to promote the Anglican tradition just a bit, as many of the artists in Birmingham that we have connected with, a lot of them have been from an evangelical background and had not grown up with any liturgy, had not grown up with any of that. And when they were introduced to the rhythm of the church year, that there were certain specific colors, that there were ways that people dealt with the details of life, and then introducing things like Lectio Divina and other spiritual practices, that's an invitation for artists to feel like they can be part of the church.
Well, thank you for your kind words about the Anglican tradition. We don't get that very much at Beeson. Yeah, I'm really grateful for those of you who brought up churches in other cultural contexts, like African American preaching and dancing and stuff like that, because it led perfectly into my next question. What role can the arts play in bridging cultural gaps that we can find between different kinds of churches, and not just racial differences, but denominational differences or language barriers or anything like that? And are there key contributions that you would highlight from specific ethnic groups or denominational groups or whatever that contribute to the church that we may not find elsewhere?
I'm trying to figure this out myself, because I think in the way that we worship, even though Sunday morning is very segregated in several senses, we're comfortable with the way that we worship. We're comfortable with the people that we go to church with. And my best friend goes to Iron City, and while she appreciates the Anglican tradition, she does not like to come to my church because of the music. So it's kind of hard to navigate around, and I don't want to sound negative, but it's hard to navigate around what we feel comfortable with. And you have to get outside of that comfortability to, bring cultures together. Even in for example, a Spanish-speaking church, if you invite them to our church, maybe 2 or 3 of our congregants speak Spanish. And so, they're outside of what makes them comfortable. So, I'm not answering your question. I'm saying that I'm looking for an answer myself.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a quagmire, right? Because if art is rooted in so many ways, like in our living into the Imago Dei, if art is rooted in the Incarnation, it is transcendent of culture in that sense. At the same time, very clearly, art is deeply embedded into culture, right? So I think maybe the arts end up being a focal point showing the potentiality of wonderful reconciliation and kind of the terror and deep wounding of separation in that sense. And I think, to be frank, just talking about, this comes up in churches I've been all the time, conversations about African-American worship and how white folk in the congregations I'm in, they always have this delight for it, and there's always this fear of it, right? The sense of, it's not me, but I love it. Even to the point of, people saying, we may suggest, hey, let's do a black gospel tune next week. Okay, yeah, but, I can't sing like that. Let's sing like what? Let's talk about that. Well, I'm not black is what comes out, right? And so there's an essentializing there, and there's not a reality that this is a deeply cultural thing, but it's a training too. So I think that I don't answer the question either, but there's a lot of potential.
Okay,
You have an
don't
answer.
go.
You have an
No,
answer.
I'm going to go with the theme of not answering the question and going sideways.
Jerry, you have so much work to do.
I know, you're going to have to take the whole question. And you're talking about a cultural gap, and I would say one of the gaps is generational. So if I can talk to that, coming from the last of the generations to the new generation, there's a gap there. I'm really excited about the new generation coming in because I think that y'all are much more relationally oriented than we were, or even the way we were oriented and trained and educated. So I came before the computer. So I was trained. I did not train like my kids have been trained, where everything is like a web. Everything relates to everything else. I was trained in almost a linear fashion that how do you outline this? How do you, I was raised Catholic, so we outline sentences, everything. So our thought process is different. We're thinking in a certain way. I'm really hopeful for your generation because everything relates to everything else. If you tap on this, it does that. And that's what art does. It's hard to explain in a linear fashion, but it's relational. Like for Inspiro, it's hard to explain what we do, but it's all about relationships, connecting one on one on one, and then in small groups, and then seeing if we can get them to have the courage to go out. I would love to see the gap be generational, that we can incorporate more of the arts relationally that way, because art fundamentally, I think, Van Gogh had said that, the best art form is to love other people. And the foundational art, at least for Inspiro, and I think the foundational art, if you're thinking evangelism, is hospitality. If you think of hospitality as an art form, man, just think of your congregations. You can ignite a lot of people around the vision that they are an artist as well, and then you're inviting people to the feast.
Christ has infinite aspects, and each culture shows some of those aspects, and no one culture shows all the aspects, and so we need all the cultures to see all of Christ, or at least parts of the infinite Christ. And when we go to another culture and experience Christian worship, as I went to Nigeria this summer, I saw more of Christ. I saw aspects of Christ I hadn't seen here, and it was wonderful. So art in worship, each culture worships in a different way that is largely derived from the way God has distributed the body of Christ around the world. So we see more of Christ's aspects when we explore the art and the culture in the worships of different churches in other parts of the world.
Okay, I have 3 more questions, and we can probably answer these relatively quickly because I want to leave time for other questions. And not everybody has to answer these last ones, but what are some of the most important pieces, films, novels, plays, paintings, whatever, that pastors and future pastors need to experience?
I'm going to pass this to you.
Okay. I don't have much. I think of, I always assign to my seminary students, I used to always assign a book called The Damnation of Theron Ware by Harold Frederick. It's a late 19th century novel. If you are going to be a pastor, I do recommend you read it. It's about the slow downward spiral of an aspiring Methodist itinerant pastor on the frontier as he becomes intoxicated with prestige and power and say it again. The Damnation of Theron Ware, Theron. Yeah, it's a great book. It fosters great discussion if you're thinking about pastoring and preaching.
I would probably encourage you not to be fearful of going to secular sources. I think the idea is try to find things that resonate, that are true. If I had to choose one as a pastor, that would be a great book or a series of books to read would be, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Marilyn Robinson, but Gilead and all of those, she is able to capture some of the humanity and struggles of a pastor that might help you, because art, one of the reasons for art is it helps you not feel alone, that you're not the only one. So that would be one book I would recommend.
2 great movies, in my opinion, my wife's opinion, that are works of art that illustrate all sorts of things about the life of faith. Babette's Feast, based on the Scandinavian Christian tradition, and the Jewish-Israeli movie, Ush Pitzin, fantastic movie about the life of faith in an Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. And then in literature, many people have said that the Russians did do theology in their literature. Dostoevsky, just about anything Dostoevsky writes. Also, a modern Russian book came out about 5-6 years ago. It's already being called, or maybe 10 years ago, Laurus, Laurus. It's already being called the best novel of the 20th century. It's a surreal novel, moving from the Middle Ages to today with the same people. Phenomenal. And then finally, a little novel about when Francis of Assisi came to New York City in the 1920s. A little classic work titled Mr. Blue. Mr. Blue.
A movie that I recommend is, I don't know how people feel about it, but it's called The Way, and it's about the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which, if you don't know about that pilgrimage, is just amazing. It's one of my goals in life to do. But also the book I mentioned earlier about Now and the parable of the prodigal son, just, it's amazing, honestly, just everything about it. And I think it will help you in trying to understand how to approach art in a spiritual way.
I think the book is actually called The Return of the Prodigal Son, and you really should read it because it's phenomenal. Okay. One more. How can churches who don't have a large population of artists or a lot of fiscal resources to patronize artists, how can they engage with the arts meaningfully and fruitfully?
I mean, I think I would just point to Inspiro, and talking to you more about it. Because my answer would be hospitality for artists is it doesn't matter how big you are, how smart you are, if you create a liturgy and you create a community that's hospitable to artists will come. The flip of that is the artists are already there. If we think about folk art, there are artists in all of your congregations. Are you enabling them? Are you encouraging them? Are you mentoring them in your liturgy, in your preaching, in your community, in your culture?
I would agree with that. I know that I'm part of a new church plant downtown, and one of the things our pastor's doing is, because we have a wealth of different artists from all backgrounds, many of whom are not believers or who have stepped away from the church, and he just asks if he can have an honest conversation with them with no agenda, no punchline at the end. He just really wants to know their story. And by doing so, he is increasing his understanding, and they're getting over being gun shy that there's a bait and switch. If I don't know if it was the call it being Amwayed. It's you'd have to be of a certain age to understand it. But so if there is love without and grace, I think that there will be an aroma there. And I also think there's a lot of artists that are hungry to do something significant, and often they're always tapped on to, can you do the mural for Vacation Bible School, because you're an artist, or they're asked to give their work away for free. And if you ever want to talk to me, if you could respect artists and respect that that's how they make their livelihood, instead of trying to just ask for things.
Can I make a shameless pitch too? So I work for the Center for Worship and the Arts here at Sanford as I knock over my water. And we actually try to work on this some. So if you're ever interested, your colleague and my colleague, Kara, can you raise your hand? Kara is a seminary student here and one of our colleagues in the Center for Worship and the Arts. We're trying to think through these kinds of things. So if you're interested in that, come talk to us and we can get you plugged into what we're doing.
I would like to add that we don't have to be art critics to encourage other people's art. If somebody is an artist and they come to you and it's not your favorite, it's not your job to tell them it's not your favorite. I think that's really important. Outside of that, it discourages the artist, but it does build up a wall and what we can do in the church with art.
All right, so it's a little after 1, so if you have a 1:15 or whatever you need to get to, now would be the time. But I figured we can open up the floor for some questions. Oh man, Tyler's got one. We've got several. Okay, I saw Tyler's hand first, so go ahead.
This kind of concretizes Andrew's previous question. To give you background to this, well, I'll just say the question is, how can the arts be used to reach people from a lower educational level and a lower socioeconomic status? Background of this question is I'm Anglican. I appreciate all that you're saying so much, but Anglicanism traditionally is very aristocratic. And at the same time, I grew up in rural southern Illinois, where people don't have a high education level, where people work in tire factories and coal mines, and they're not particularly the most creatively minded people. They don't read books. It's not criticism, it's just a fact. So if I were to go back to southern Illinois as an Anglican and plant an Anglican church, how could the arts be used effectively for me to proclaim and visualize the gospel for people like that?
I'm gonna answer that first.
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
You have this issue outside of the church. When I worked at the art museum for a little bit of time, part of my job was to invite people from the other side of the mountain to the art museum to let them know that this is a free place for you to come. But the problem is that art is not taught in most public schools in poor areas. It's not. The only thing that they're exposed to a lot of times is music, and that's what's popular music. And a lot of that can be negative. So you have two issues with that, as outside of the Christian context, people aren't responding to art. So I think you have to, in my opinion, you have to approach that first and make it a norm. Don't make it like we have this big art event and you should come. It's just start incorporating it, a little bit. I don't know what that looks like because I've been in a church now that's on this side of the mountain for some time now. But I do know that my family that go to other churches, it's almost unheard of for them to just go to an art show. They wouldn't do it because it's pretentious is how they would see it. So you have to change the narrative, and that's really difficult because it's already been set in stone that people that like art are rich, they have enough money to buy the art, and that they've been educated on it. And I'm not just talking about visual art. There are different types, but if there is, because we've touched on this, we are in some way artistic. So, I mean, the chances of you going to a poor area and there being some little girl that doesn't know how to dance, I mean, that's impossible. So you can even reach them through what they already know, but that has to be first before you introduce anything else, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think practically, so when I've been in Anglican congregations, I have intentionally started to bring the banjo in, and I get a lot of pushback on that. Now, the banjo is not a good example because it's pretty hip too, right? But let's assume it wasn't hip. It's a folk instrument. And so for me in North Carolina, it was reaching out to a constituency that were folk-oriented. So I think reaching out in practical ways into folk art can be helpful. However, the asterisk to that is that I think this issue you bring up is a justice issue, because I think that poverty in this country is not only financially impoverishing, it is impoverishing of beauty. And there have been minority groups that have done, frankly, miraculous artistic work. I think about the ghettoization of African Americans and the rise of even Afro-Pentecostal music in the early 20th century, blues, jazz, et cetera, beauty coming out of terror. But at the same time, there's still plenty, and you think about white poverty, rural white poverty, therein is an impoverishing continually now of beauty. And this wasn't always the case. There were folk traditions that thrived within lower socioeconomic cultures, and that is being impoverished and ravaged. So in many ways, even maybe low socioeconomic congregants who are in your congregation, they don't have any, not just training, they've been so burdened with survival that beauty is not something they have created a habit of knowing. And so part of, I think, of your job is not even just educating them to enjoy it, not educating them to consume it, and to enjoy it, but also to start to learn that they are sub-creators, that they can create it. So to think of it that way may be helpful.
The only thing I would say is for you to watch Babette's Feast several times to see what good gift you can begin to give to soften the congregation through love and giving them of beauty to soften them.
It's true that Anglicanism recently in this country has been more of the upper SES levels, but that's not historically been so. In the 19th century, Anglo-Catholics had an incredible ministry to the poorest of the poor in the slums of England, and no one else wanted to minister to them. And Anglicanism today is exploding in the global South, especially Africa, where quite often they're very, very poor. But you think of liturgy and sacrament, if that's artistic, and I think it is, has thrived for 2,000 years, mostly amongst poor people.
Yeah, let's see.
Can I actually add to something that real quick? So in my old church, St. Mark's Episcopal Church is off Green Springs. One thing that they've been doing since I was little is having, I think it's like called Jazz Under the Stars or something like that. But it's a way of inviting the community to get comfortable with the church, get comfortable with the pastor, but also having music for them to enjoy. So to reach out to the churches that you're already in, if you're in a poor area, or I always say the other side of the mountain because most people know what that means, is to invite them, to paint like a mural. I think that's the most beautiful thing to do in a neighborhood, is to find a wall and paint a mural on it, and to get the people in the community to join in, because it allows them to not just see art, but to make art. That's the last thing.
Amos, you had a question? Let's go.
Is Gary your pastor?
Yeah, Gary Purdy.
So, this question might get y'all in trouble, or it may not answer your own discretion. So, would y'all be opposed to defining what good art is? I know that's a very subjective question. So how do you define, like, big, what is good art? And then personally, what do you think is good art? That's a difficult question. And then part two of my question is a distinction between art for the church and art from the church.
Anybody want to take this softball?
This softball.
So good art is true. Good art is true. And that will get you in trouble eventually. But in the sense, too, that every art piece probably has true and untrue elements, right? But good art is true. Art for the church and from the church, I mean, they have, in some sense, they have to be the same thing at some point, right? That the church needs to be creating its own art. And that art needs to be not just for people outside of the church, it needs to be internally for the church. I think that's it right now, yeah.
I would resonate with that, and I probably get myself in trouble, but art that is done specifically to be Christian art is often not as effective. Is that said politically well? But like, we know artists that have felt either one, that they are of no value, that there's a hierarchy, that if they're not a pastor or a missionary, that's the true calling, that an artist does not have as much worth. And so they scramble around and go, and the people are telling them, well, if you just add scripture to your art, add something to it or do that. So if any art that has a agenda to it or is didactic, is usually not as moving. It feels manipulative versus true, something that is true and has to be said. And as far as that, it's hard for me to parse apart the art from the church, art to the church, because I think more globally than that. I think good art will stimulate good conversation.
I think we get really upset about Christian art. We do, right? We're like, this is just often bad art. It's copycat art. And this is what happens a lot, particularly in music. And I think this is just such a part of it. It comes back to me for it's the utilitarian nature of it, right? So Amy Grant, when she releases her second album and they're constructing it out in the mid-'80s, it's being released as a wholesome alternative for Madonna, right? It's not being released because this is a genuine, authentic expression of something. Now, this is picking on Amy. There's plenty of genuine things going on in that album, right? But in the sense of like the way it's marketed. And so people get upset because, and I think in the end, it's utilitarian. For Christians, so many of us as Christians, we see art as utilitarian instead of an integral part of being human is creating art. So if good art is true art, untrue art is propaganda, right? That's what it is. And so I think it's easy, it can be easy to feel that. I can't. And that's part of the problem, I think, right? So that's a complex, layered thing. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's that it's contingent into a culture. It's contingent into a knowledge of Scripture, into a community. And that's part of the hard work is creating cultures that can discern between true and untrue. I think that's the heart of the problem, more so than is art Christian or not? Is it untrue or true, and where is it true? And that's a huge. That's what you're going to do. That's why you're going to get paid the big bucks to be a pastor and do that, right? I mean, that's part of the good work that you all are going out to do, though, and that's part of your calling is to somehow create cultures of faithful discernment in terms of the arts.
I can answer this question for a really long time. I love debating about what is good art. But it all boils down to that my opinion does not matter what is good art, because what I think is good, somebody else may not think is good. So I do agree with the true. Is this true? Because for me, I look at a piece sometimes. I went a few years ago, I went to the Louvre and I saw the sculpture of Nike of Samothrace, and I cried. I literally cried because of how beautiful she was. And then my friend walked up to me and was like, "What's wrong with you?" So she was seeing the same thing that I was seeing, and it did nothing for her. So I think from my own experience that good art for yourself is what makes you feel. Good art is what makes you respond to it. And even art that you consider bad, it gives you can respond to it because you may feel anger. You're feeling an emotion. You can look at a canvas that was painted red with a green line on it, and you can say, "This is trash." And this is the best story very quickly. I went to the High Museum of Art a few years ago when they had the girl with the pearl earring there, and you walk through the whole gallery and you're seeing all these beautiful pieces of art, and I get to her and I'm just like, I cannot believe she's here, and I'm in front of her and I'm just feeling it. And these three people walked up and they said, "It doesn't even look like a pearl." That was their response to it. It did nothing for them. But for me, it doesn't mean that Vermeer is a bad painter. It just means that they didn't feel anything. So yeah, I'm going off of that is true. So don't focus too much on what is good art because that differs for everybody. Music, dance, visual art, all of that, it differs.
All right, Justin.
I'm sure this applies more broadly to all the arts. I'm thinking specifically about music, so I'll just say I'm asking about music. We're going to be, as pastors, as church leaders, and as church musicians, working in congregations with people who all have these different levels of engagement, music from classical to the vernacular, and everything in between. So as we're trying to shape our congregation's voices musically and our congregational worship, what are some things we can think about to be able to do that well and engaging all of those different people with different backgrounds without making this musical row mud?
This will be your cross to bear, number one. Like, there's no fix for this. Does the music submit to the gospel? Does the music submit to the liturgy? And I mean that in the broad charitable sense, right? Not in like a constricting sense. So the liturgy is like jazz, right? It has these clear boundaries, and within those boundaries, there are movement for freedom. For me, it was always, where's the constituency? Where is my congregation? Where are they coming from? Where are they bubbling up from? And for many churches nowadays, there's lots of different constituencies within. No one's happy. The pop music stuff is fine for me. Like, that's what I trade in, it's what I write in, it's what I research. So low art, in that sense, I have a bias for, because I think that it has beauty in it that is often not blossomed. Sure, there's a lot of bad low art, but bad low music, but I think there's a beauty there. So my whole thing has been, how do I fuse these worlds and put them in conversations with each other, which in the end makes everyone upset. And we just find ways to continue to work through that.
I've been in some contexts where the arts have become an idol, and it's really salvation by the imagination. And I think we have to, that's the other extreme we have to be aware of.
Yeah.
Any other? Oh yeah, Josh.
So like the church has at certain points in history like rejected certain types of art. So like tragedies, the early church didn't, and some like influential leaders, and then like play productions and
Yeah, really quick. So back to, is it true? And by that I mean, this is back to your question, I got thinking more about it. Is it honest? And two, like, does it, and this is back to this other point, does it submit to the gospel? Does it submit to the liturgy? So one of the issues with rap, just in a fundamental rhythmic sense, is that it's hard for the congregation to sing it. Now, that statement in and of itself is cultured, right? And so there very well could be cultures where that's not fair. It's pretty easy for us to do that. But it's contextualized. I don't think there's, the universals, I would shy away from this. I think more about how is this incarnated in this moment? How is it contextualized in this moment? For each of those church history, those are deeply incarnated and contextualized to those moments, right? And so that would be my encouragement, to think about what is the theological contextualization that needs to happen here in that moment.
I think we're going to end it there. We're past 1:15. Let's thank our panel for coming.